Hello Art 1 students. So the beginning of this video is just going to be sort of the first couple of steps towards drawing the human eye based on your human features packet. Remember, I have the exact same packet that you do, and this is available to you on Google Classrooms as well, because I do know that some of you prefer to look on the computer screen while you work, and that is perfectly fine. So whether you want to work from the paper copy or from the computer screen, you'll still be able to learn the same techniques and practice the same skills. So there are obviously a couple of different ways to begin drawing any of the human features, but a couple of the big things are to make sure that you are looking for the basic shapes. So for instance, when I am looking here at my packet, I know that eventually I'm going to get down here where I have full shading, detail, highlights, shadows, all of that. But the first thing that I want to do is look for the really simple, basic shapes that make up that more complicated shape. And then what I want to do is add complexity to those basic shapes and get all of my lines drawn correctly before I do any type of shading. Now on your packet, it has you start with the eyelid area. I tend to usually start with the iris, which is the colored part of the eye. So I basically just start with the circle. And I will zoom in here in just a minute to make sure you guys can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to start drawing my eye by just starting with the circle that is going to eventually be the iris, and I will add the rest of the eye around that spot. Now, your circle does not have to be perfect, so some of you have complained saying that you can't draw a perfect circle. That's absolutely fine, because when you are drawing a human eye, and when you look at a human eye, you'll see that not necessarily all of the iris, all of that circle is even visible. So then the next thing I'm going to do is just kind of make a little mark where the corner of the eye goes on this side, and then a little mark up here where the corner of the eye goes on the other side. And those little dots are about the radius of the iris. And then what I'm going to do is looking at my image here, which you guys can kind of see here, but you can see it better in person and or on the computer. And then I'm just going to draw that first step. So it's okay if it's not 100% perfect. It's okay if, like mine, you kind of scribble that line in there. The main thing here is that I want you to see that I am basically drawing right through that initial circle that I had. So at this point, if I needed to make the circle a little smaller, I could. If I needed to adjust that initial shape, I could. And unlike usual, I'm going to go ahead and erase the part of the iris that goes on the outside. Typically, we don't erase this early in our drawing, but because we want to make sure that we get rid of that part, we're going to go ahead and erase. And I'm also going to make my circle just a little smaller. Mostly on that one side to give myself a little more of the white of the eye there. So as you can see, the upper lid line, the lower lid line, both intersect that eye. So now the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and finish up drawing the details that I see on the example image. So I'm just carefully, kind of very lightly drawing all those lines in. Remembering that it is okay when you need to turn the page, if you need to start over, if your lines are not completely exact. It is very important, though, that you are looking more at your reference image in this case than at what you were drawing. Because if you were looking more at your own drawing, then you're not teaching yourself to observe closely. What we want to do is make sure that we look more at our reference image so that eventually our brain and our hand are just going to be synchronized so that our hand will kind of automatically do what our brain sees. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of time, so be patient with yourself. Give yourself some grace and do not give up if you start to feel frustrated. So cleaning up some of my lines before I move to the next step. Now then, their next step, they go ahead and draw in that highlight. And you'll notice that on a human eye, the highlight is not usually perfectly square or perfectly round. It's kind of a weird shape, typically. And it does often overlap the pupil. So there I've drawn in sort of my highlight and where the pupil is going to go. And then your example piece starts with shading on the iris itself. I tend to start shading on the pupil. And so what I'm going to do is go ahead and start toward the middle of the pupil with a bit of a starburst that just goes around and around. Still not jumping directly in with my darkest value yet, even though I do know that the pupil is typically the darkest part of the eye, because like anything, we want to build up our shading and our value and our detail in layers. So you'll notice that each sort of cycle around this starburst, it gets lighter and lighter as it moves out. Because your transition from the pupil to the iris is not as harsh of a line as what most people tend to think. So what we want to do is make sure that that's a bit of a gradual transition. And then we can darken up that center part of the pupil here. And then continue that starburst sort of pattern. Again, radiating out from that darkest part. Avoiding the highlights. And just kind of filling in the majority of the iris there until we get all the way to the outer edge, and we're drawing very lightly at this point. So then if you look at step 3, you'll see that that's where some of the shading on your example piece starts to actually come into play. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to darken the outer edge of my iris a little bit here, paying attention to where it is the darkest and where it is lightest. Turning my page to make it a bit easier for myself. So then what I'm going to do with that iris slightly darkened is very similar to what I was doing on the inside of the pupil. And I'm just going to sort of do like the outer edge of that starburst, gradually getting lighter, then move toward the middle of the iris. So now we're kind of going in the opposite direction. It's darkest on the outside and then gets a little lighter as we move in toward the pupil. And remember, this is still early stages, so not all of your detail, not all of your shading, shadows, highlights, all that information is going to be there yet. This is still just setting everything up for the shading, basically. Again, feel free to turn the page however often you need. I find that turning the page helps, not only because it allows me to hold my pencil in a more effective way, but sometimes when we work on something upside down, we kind of tend to look at it more in terms of value than thinking about what it actually is that we're drawing. And when we can think about the values that we see and mimicking those values, then we tend to actually draw better than when we focus on what it is that we are drawing and trying to make it look right. If we just focus on the values and the lines, the shapes of the shadows, the shapes of the highlights, and the placement of those things, and not think of it as an eye, nose, mouth, anything like that, then your facial features are going to actually end up being more accurate. So at this point, I'm also going to go ahead and do just a little bit of shading, holding my pencil really far back, just in that sort of crease above the eye here. So same concept as when we were shading those spheres and the value scales that we did at the beginning of the year. You want it to be a nice smooth transition from dark to light. And then I'm also going to extend this shadow because essentially your eyeball, the whole eye, is under that upper eyelid. So it's going to have a shadow that kind of connects across the whole shape there. And again, this is still my early stages. Nothing is quite as dark as that darkest value is going to be yet. My highlights might get a little bit lost at this point, but the main thing is when you are shading at this point, really try to make sure that you keep the bulk of your highlight as light as possible so that if you do erase a little bit later on to bring some of those highlights back, you're just lightening. You're not trying to completely put the highlight back in there. So now I'm going to go on to that fourth step, which basically just is a little more shading on the white part of the eye, which again, we want to make sure we keep that part very light. So right now I'm using my pencil, but I will eventually use a tortillon there as well to just really smooth out the glassiness of the white part of the eye. Barely pressing down at all. And again, making sure that I am not using a mechanical pencil. Simply because the mechanical pencil is great for line work and small detail, but it's not great for shading. Holding my pencil really far back, using the tip of the pencil, and just creating different value transitions wherever I see them. The big thing about drawing the human face is that people tend to use line a lot more than they need to. But if you really look at the shadows and the highlights and the details that are on the human face, they're really just series of value shifts and changes, not so much actual lines. So we want to make sure that we kind of avoid making things too much of a line. So again, just kind of adding a little more value where I see it on my example pieces. Remember that you can look up other reference images if that helps you. You can watch other tutorials. You can practice as much as you need to. But each day this week, you have a different facial feature that is due. So in your next video, I'm just going to continue working on the eye a little bit based on what I've been seeing in class so I can help to make sure that I am giving you guys a demonstration that is going to actually be beneficial. And then the next set of videos will be for the nose, and then the last set will be for the mouth, before we discuss how we are going to be going about the rest of the packet. Because as mentioned before, you will not necessarily finish the whole packet, but you will do a lot of it as you practice your shading. Because the main goal here is learning to draw observationally and to shade accordingly. And as I mentioned before, another really important thing is to make sure that you are not smudging too much. A lot of people at this point just stick their finger in there and rub their graphite all over the place. You want to create your value changes with your pencil. Not with your finger, not with the tortillon, but with your actual pencil. And then I will show you how, in a future video, how you can use that tortillon to just soften up and make the eye look even glassier.